Welcome, everybody. I don't know what they put in the water at the classics department at Stanford, but it seems to produce an extraordinary series of really remarkable, ambitious books spanning millennia, multiple disciplines, multiple regions of the world. Josiah Ober's great work on ancient Athens and democracy, Ian Morris, Why the West Rules for Now and the Case for War, and not least, two great books by today's speaker, published within 2 years of each other. I don't know how you did that. Two great fat books. The Great Leveler, an extraordinarily complex, rigorous argument about what we will hear about today, how difficult it is to counter inequality, as I say, spanning millennia, combining quantitative and qualitative methods, an extraordinary range of sources, and then just 2 years later, Escape from Rome, a volume exploring the familiar argument that it was precisely the diversity of Europe, the fact that we didn't have a single centralized empire, that may be the key to understanding why Europe led the way to industrial modernity and the great divergence. So I was absolutely riveted by both these books. So when I heard that Walter Scheidel was going to be at Cambridge, just up the road, and not a long way away in Stanford, my other university, I thought I'd give him a challenge, which is, could he combine the theme of these two books in one talk? And remarkably, that is what he is promising to do in today's talk, on escaping from inequality. Is Europe trapped by history? So, Walter, we're very much looking forward. Please join me in welcoming our speaker.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation and the very kind introduction. I may have promised to do that, but I'm able to do it. We'll find out in the next half hour or so. I should also, I don't know if I should apologize. I don't have any slides. This is the first time I've talked about inequality, in particular without slides, because usually when anybody talks about inequality, there are slides and curves going up and down, so going up, right, in the case of inequality. And I thought I'm sort of done with that because I operate now at a fairly high level of abstraction. And there's a more technical reason too, which is we have a pretty good sense of the broad picture, because otherwise I couldn't be talking about this. But it's very difficult to pin down. There's a lot of debate about where exactly the line is supposed to be. Because even for 20th century data, it's pretty difficult to establish inequality metrics because you rely on tax returns where people, lie all the time, and on household surveys, all kinds of things. So the line is never really quite where it's drawn. So I thought maybe it's easier to just get rid of the lines altogether and give you the broad picture. Now, what is the broad picture? The broad picture is that, and my brief is also talking about Europe. So I'll do that. If you look at Europe, inequality in terms of income and wealth, I will only talk about economic inequality. There are many kinds of income and wealth inequality pretty much peaked at some point right before World War I, a little over 100 years ago, regardless of where in Europe you look. That was the culmination of a much longer trend. However, we have evidence that goes back far enough. We can see it's a trend that starts with the abatement of the Black Death, probably at the end of the Middle Ages. So we have 400 years, in some cases, of rising economic inequality, not in a linear fashion, but in the long term. The only event in that period that really significantly reduces inequality, we now know, I didn't know this yet when I wrote the book, because that's based on more recent research by people who went to the archives in Germany, was the 30 Years' War in Germany. And the 30 Years' War in Germany was not a very happy period, I think, of German or any kind of history. But it's emblematic of my thesis, for those who are not familiar with it, that only very massive, usually violent shocks tend to significantly reduce economic inequality. in pre-modern societies, state collapse, or big pandemics like the Black Death. In the modern age, in 20th century, mass mobilization warfare, and transformative, i.e. communist revolution, and that's about it. So, and prior to that, you have because there's a fair amount of stability in Europe, you have an upward trend in inequality. That is a European phenomenon, or at best a Western phenomenon, narrowly defined. It includes North America, so lagging behind, but it's on the same trend line, if you will. We don't observe it in Japan. In Tokugawa, Japan, inequality levels are very stable for a long period of time, and inequality growth really only picks up in the Meiji period, late 19th century till World War II. There are big waves in Latin America, early colonial, late colonial, post-colonial, first globalization. It goes up and down. It's difficult to measure, but there's a great deal of fluctuation in Latin America. So Europe really stands out in those 400 years in that economic inequality trends up very aggressively, in as much as there is debate about it. It's about, I would say, minutiae, whether in a few countries inequality had already peaked before World War I, or whether in a very few places like Sweden it might already have begun to go down a little bit. But that's really a different level of resolution. What's also clear is that there's a massive drop between 1914 and 1945, and then for the next generation into the 70s, a more attenuated form of further equalization. That is part of a semi-global shift. It occurs not just in Western Europe, it occurs in the US, it occurs in Japan, it occurs in China for different reasons, right? It's takeover communists, of course, in Eastern Europe and in China. It's the world wars and their consequences in Western Europe, US, Canada, Japan. It's war-related disruptions in South Korea and Taiwan. Later on, it's not truly planetary, because if you look at Africa with decolonization, outcomes are pretty mixed. If you look at Latin America, inequality remains very high. There is no downturn up to about 2000, so it's a very different kind of picture. So about half of the world experiences this attenuation. Now, in Europe, as I said, there are really two drivers. East of the Iron Curtain, it's communism. I have to explain why communism reduces economic inequality through collectivization, planned economies, and so on. In the Western market economies, it's full of returns on capital due to regulation associated with war, the Great Depression, disruption, progressive taxation, unionization, inflation, destruction. It depends on what country you're looking at. It carries forward for another generation after 1945, the welfare state. Again, high levels of taxation, still strong unions, mass education, reduced skill premiums, protections from cheap labor, both within societies through unions, collective bargaining, and so on, and from without. There is no industrial reserve army out there providing cheap labor outside the West. The changes, of course, after the 1970s, you have all kinds of changes, deregulation, financialization, automation, globalization, 1 billion workers at low incomes being added to the world economy. It's probably the single most important factor that has disequalizing effects on high income societies. There is now a clear trend. In as much as there is a clear trend, it is that from about the 80s onwards, so for the last 40 years, the share of capital income in all income has been continuously rising, and the share of returns to labor income has been gradually but steadily been going down in Western countries, in the US and UK, in other Western economies. So that's in line with the great leveler narrative that if you have peace, stability, and so on, you're not going to get any significant attenuation of inequality. I said this in 2017. A couple of years ago, I did a review for the Princeton Classics edition of the book. So I looked at every single article that had used my book to see if I had been disproven yet. And it turns out it was not the case. So it's still holding up reasonably well. There are currently no comparable leveling forces active in the developed world. COVID was an excellent counterexample. For about 5 minutes when the pandemic started in 2020, some pundit said, oh, this is now a Scheidelian shock of some kind, rather than pandemic, and inequality is going to go down like in the 14th century. During the Black Death, well, not so, because mortality was luckily vastly lower, especially in the working age population. There was a tiny effect, right? There were labor shortages because of people withdrawing from the labor market. There was less wage dispersion for a year or two, and then it was all eaten up by inflation. Working is a very small effect. Overall, state intervention upheld existing arrangements, technological innovation, remote work, remote education, medical science, RNA vaccines. So the system that upheld the existing order, which is conducive to inequality, was much more resilient than it would have been in the past. There was no equalizing shock. There are no big revolutions, as far as I know. Mass mobilization warfare, but we have it in Ukraine, right? Ushered to, especially in Ukraine. Who knows? I'm not sure. You might know if there are any credible numbers from Ukraine at this point. There is hope that once, if the war is really over at some point and the dust settles and we have better statistics, we'll see if that had some kind of equalizing effect, reducing corruption. I don't know. Hiding accountability. It's difficult to say. It would be a very interesting case, but we don't know yet. So what's the situation in Western Europe? There's no plausible leveler in sight, and yet there's not necessarily a particularly dramatic crisis of inequality. It's very easy to talk about an inequality crisis. I think 3 books were published just by Princeton recently about, the inequality crisis, either in the UK or in Western Europe more generally. So it's easy to talk about this, but it's worth remembering that constraints on inequality, especially after taxes and transfers, are actually quite strong in Western Europe, stronger arguably than in most other parts of the world. Why is this? One argument that was made a while ago is that in Europe, pre-distribution is stronger than elsewhere. Pre-distribution would be, it's a funny word in a way, right? It's anything that reduces the dispersion of gross, incomes and wages through any number of things like collective bargaining, institutions, norms, what have you. That would then make it easier to keep down overall levels of inequality without aggressive redistributive interventions. There's even the argument that the US is more redistributive than Western countries, which may seem counterintuitive because we always think of the US, it's low tax and not very progressive. The point, though, is that in the US, market income pre-taxes and transfer is so unequally distributed that even if there's more progressivity in redistribution, the overall outcome is still worse than in Europe. So effective inequality at the end is still higher than it would be in Europe, just for slightly different reasons. That's a contested finding. It's contested especially because it depends on how we define tax and transfer income, whether we, for instance, include pensions. You can treat pensions as a transfer, something that occurs later in the game. You can treat it as deferred income. And if it's deferred income, then it's actually right? It's at the beginning, even if people don't get it till they retire, which is a bit of an accounting trick, I think. But the results that you get differ greatly depending on how you define the terms. So again, that's the reason there are those slides, right? Because whatever you are shown, you have to be aware of how these things were come by. Now, regardless of which metrics we apply, Western Europe is in pretty good shape, including the UK, because by any metric, 1%, top 1% income share, top 10% income share are systematically higher in the US than in any Western European country. So in that sense, there is no really dramatic inequality crisis by that standard, at least. In Europe, we know why European pre-distribution is fairly strong. It's rooted in collective bargaining, minimum wages, other forms of regulation. And once you factor in things like pension or public provision of healthcare, if you can work all these things into these metrics and these estimates, you end up with relatively equitable outcomes, at least compared to many other parts of the world. Now, does that mean that everything is wonderful? In which case we could just have dinner. Not really. While there are effects at work, it is true that pre-distribution has weakened, but it weakened in Western Europe mostly in the 80s and 90s. It has actually remained, so pre-tax and transfer income distribution has remained fairly stable for about 25 years. That's a quarter of a century. So that's not a really very pressing crisis right now. In formerly communist countries, there was a lag effect. It happened mostly in the 90s, of course, with the end of communism, that all of a sudden you have much more dispersion of incomes than before. But even that has been fairly flat for some time. So there's a fair amount of stability at a relatively manageable level of inequality. Redistribution is still going strong. There's no question about that. So is that a challenge to the level of thesis? The answer is no. And I have to point this out because I have encountered this very many times. There is a difference between reducing inequality and keeping it flat. The thesis is about significant reductions of inequality. And that, as far as I can see, always requires some kind of dramatic intervention, some kind of dramatic shock. Keeping it level at whatever level it happens to be doesn't necessarily, right? Existing institutions and policy choices are perfectly sufficient, as we can see in recent outcomes. Other more cheerful alternatives. One was actually proposed, I don't know if anybody in this room has heard about this, by a Swedish economist called Daniel Waldenström. Come across that. He wrote a book 2 years ago called Richer and More Equal. It's a very cheerful message. The message is that for part of the 20th century, certain Western countries, UK, France, Germany, Spain, Sweden, and US, became richer, more wealth was generated per capita, and was also more evenly distributed. So it's the perfect outcome, right? Everybody's better off, and inequality goes down at the same time. This looks only at wealth, I should say, not at income. The explanation for this is that there's a shift away from what you might call elite wealth, like investments in corporations and equity and private estates and so on, and towards people's wealth that manifests in the spread of private home ownership and in pensions, right? That people. And again, this is tricky, right? Defining pension payouts as a function of wealth, because unless it's private pensions, it doesn't really come out of what is usually defined as private wealth, but it can be a functional equivalent. And in those respects, those were the main drivers of reducing wealth inequality in those Western countries in much of the 20th century. Although if you look at this more closely, you're basically back to square one, because in the first half of the 20th century, wealth inequality went down, not because so much of home ownership and pension, it went down because elite wealth was destroyed more rapidly than the limited wealth of the general population. And so wealth inequality went down, but for a very different reason. Then you have the 50s, 60s, 70s, where this effect took place that he describes. And from the 80s onwards, elite wealth has once again gained the upper hand. So that's the story you see in Piketty's work, in my survey, in others, that these shocks are bad for elites, and that the post-war period is the one where you really have peaceful attenuation of inequality. There are further problems. The problems are, if pensions and private home ownership used to be drivers, significant drivers of equalization, well, how are they holding up? In the case of pensions, there are more and more private pension schemes. The basic intuition would be that private pension schemes work best for people who have money to spare, right? So they are not really equalizing at all. The better off people can invest more in their own, retirement and then reap the benefit. And if you have a shift in the balance of public payouts versus private payouts in pension schemes, that cannot be equalizing. At least that's the intuition. People have looked into it. There is no simple answer. The short answer is there is no single answer. It depends very much on what happens in a particular country. It depends on the particular configuration of circumstances in that country. But it's no longer really equalizing. Well, with home ownership, I don't think I'm revealing any state secrets that home ownership is no longer a driver of equalization because of rising valuations and accessibility, affordability issues, and transgenerational transfers within families. So there is no way that home ownership today is an equalizing force, not in the UK for sure, and not in many other Western countries either, although it varies quite a bit, depending on what country you're looking at. There was even I think it was a grad student at MIT when Piketty's big book came out, Capital in the 21st Century. who tried to show that most of the increase in wealth inequality in recent decades was driven by homeownership. That so much wealth was now tied up in people's homes that appreciate disproportionately. That by itself drove up wealth inequality. That may be an exaggeration, but it shows that forces that used to be equalizing have now sort of flipped in a way, and they tend to become more dis-equalizing. As if this wasn't enough, there are additional problems. I like to talk about problems. Timothy said I should be optimistic, but I will still talk about problems. One, of course, is with respect to equalization would be immigration. The idea being that migration from outside Europe may erode support for redistribution that would then have equalizing effects. That used to be a theory mostly based on the experience of the US, where you would take American heterogeneity as an explanation for the relative stinginess of government. It has, in the meantime, I think, been vindicated in a way. It's certainly one of the main slogans of growing populist movements. This country, France and Germany, all over the place. And that's really just the beginning. So that's a trend that is ongoing, arguably. You get the problem, the issue, it's not a problem, the success of secular aging, where more and more resources need to be spent on things like healthcare, the last 6 months of life and so on, which again doesn't have an equalizing effect on the general population. And it's no longer possible to give a talk about anything without mentioning AI. So I'm mentioning AI, so you can tick off that box. I'm not going to make any predictions about AI, but in as much as you can make a plausible prediction, it is that AI, unless it's a total bust, is going to sustain and reinforce the shifting balance between returns to capital and returns to labor that I already referenced before. The more you invest in those machines and the more you gain from that, the less important returns to labor, human labor, are going to become. Now, of course, technological change like this does not exist in a vacuum, and the inequality outcomes of technological change are really driven by the interaction of technological change and institutional arrangements. That has always been the case. It has always been the case going back many thousands of years when people invented the plow, the ox-driven plow, that had interacted with institutional arrangements and drove up inequality as we can now reconstruct. It was like this at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and it is now the case with automation, may still be the case with the spread of AI. The actual outcome, though, is not sort of autonomously determined by technology. It's determined also by the institutional response, which is a function of power dynamics, or what Piketty in his more recent work calls inequality regimes. This is when the European political landscape finally comes in, because my charge is to look at the other book as well. So what makes Europe special in that respect? I can think of two very extraordinarily abstract points. One is that the European format of the nation state that crystallizes in the 19th century in its mature form, should all other things being equal, which they may not be, tend to be more equalizing than not. If you think of investment in mass education, in healthcare, extension of the franchise, and a number of things. So in the most abstract terms, you would expect the nation state as a format to be more likely than other forms of organization to deliver more equalizing outcomes, which historically is not necessarily the case, but that would be an intuition. The other goes back to the point about fragmentation and long-lasting polycentrism that in Europe really goes back to the fall of the Roman Empire, which is a very long time ago. And according to many people, and I sort of summarized their work in my 2019 book, really one way or the other underpins what we might call European exceptionalism, for want of a better word, the great divergence that Europe is first in pulling ahead of other parts of the world in certain domains, economic, science, any number of things, whether through institutions, whether through disruptive science, whether through competition for external resources that manifests in colonialism, you name it. So the question is that form of enduring polycentrism and fragmentation and diversity and pluralism, is that also relevant for outcomes in terms of inequality, which I think is a question that hasn't really been asked very much, if at all. Now, at first blush, the answer is actually probably no, in terms of what I said earlier, right? I talked about rising inequality in Europe, Western Europe, any kind of Europe, up to about 1900 or beyond. That occurs across Europe, right? In very different kinds of countries, very different kind of political systems with different configurations of institutions. It's a fairly synchronized development. And then the reduction in inequality after 1914 is also very strongly synchronized because it's driven by similar factors in various countries. They're all exposed in equal fashion to those effects. There are no signs of meaningfully different pathways in terms of inequality development, unlike, let's say, the little divergence in economic development, where North Sea adjacent countries would experience stronger growth earlier than other European countries, and you see different pathways within Europe for quite a long time. There is nothing similar that I can see in the inequality data. So you can see a great deal of parallel synchronized development that encompasses the whole range of entities in Europe that are quite diverse in a great many ways. And it's worth pointing out that even today, in terms of either pre or post tax and transfer inequality, the United Kingdom is more similar to Sweden than it is to the United States. You may not think of it that way, but it actually really is. So there's a pan-European story to be told with respect to inequality. Now, the next question is then, well, has European unification, the EU or whatever, has that made a difference, right? Can you see more recently some kind of convergence with respect to inequality outcomes? Well, it depends on what kind of convergence you're interested in. If you're interested in inequality between countries, there has been a great deal of convergence because Europe at the country by country level is less unequal than it used to be because lower income countries have grown faster than higher income countries. And so there is convergence in that respect if you treat each country as a unit. Has there been convergence within countries? That's the real question. That's the other outcome is unsurprising. That's pretty much a given. But has there been convergence within countries? Almost not. There's only a single case in which European countries within the Eurozone, also including the UK, have converged. And that is with respect to the famous 1%, right? The top tier of the income distribution. This is where you see convergence in the last, 30 years, since 95, in the last 30 years across 17 Eurozone countries. So the 1% are becoming more similar over time. That's the one metric where you see the convergence. There are many inequality metrics I'm not going to bore you with. There's the Gini coefficient that tries to establish a single measurement for the entire population. There's the top 10% income share. There's the bottom 50% income share. There's the ratio of the 20th percentile to the 80th percentile. There are any number of different indices. And for all of these other indices, there is no convergence among those 17 Eurozone countries, remarkably. For each of these metrics, you usually see two clusters of countries, like 5 countries here and 7 countries over there and a few outliers. But the clusters are never the same. If you change the metric, you still have 2 clusters, but the different countries in the clusters. So it's really amazingly mixed up depending on the local, regional conditions. There is no story to tell. There's no north-south story. It's not like Northern Europe versus the Mediterranean. It's not core periphery. It's not even east of the former Iron Curtain and west of the former Iron. It's all these are not meaningful distinctions in this particular case. So, and if you include the UK in this, it would still be the same. It's no longer included because of now Eurozone. The same is true of the inequality effects of pension systems. To return one more time to pension systems, because there are many different kinds of pension systems. In Europe, there are comprehensive systems, like in France and Germany, that are relatively generous and relate payouts strongly to earnings. There are more basic systems that are also slightly more progressive, like in the UK or Denmark, the hybrid systems, where you have more private provisions or less private provisions, and so on and so forth. Turns out that the equalizing effect of pension schemes, counterintuitively perhaps, depends not so much on progressivity, but on the overall volume of the payouts. So the more generous the systems are, the more equalizing they tend to be. At the same time, the more generous systems, on average, tend to be less progressive. And the more progressive ones tend to be less generous, which may well have political reasons in terms of how you sustain different kinds of pension systems. Once again, cut a long story short, outcomes are all over the place. Configurations are all over the place. Outcomes are all over the place. There is no systematic, picture scenario that unites all these European countries. So what can be derived from this? It's pretty clear that stability and European integration have favored the 1%, elite circles. It's not surprising. They benefit disproportionately from mobility, from bidding up wages, from bigger markets, opportunities, and so on. But otherwise, there is great heterogeneity for the general population, which means that European diversity has actually been maintained very successfully or very stably. So in that respect, Europe is in fact still trapped by history. It's trapped by the national histories of the different units within Europe that all produce their own specific outcomes in ways that cannot easily be related to outcomes in other countries. Which is interesting because it means that underneath the shared broad secular trends, inequality goes up, inequality goes down, inequality goes up again. There are all these idiosyncratic, unsystematic ways that don't really match any overarching pattern except for the consolidation of the 1% across different nations and their specific systems. This also suggests that there is no clear effect of emulation or adaptation, that one country would look at the neighboring country and say, let's do it like this because it works really well. This doesn't seem to be happening. Outcomes continue to be governed by local configurations in terms of redistribution, policies that equalize more via taxes, more via benefits, more via pensions, more via other things. It's really all over the place. The one feature where you see convergence within Europe regarding the 1%, well, that's not a European feature. That's a global feature because you see this all over the world, right? It's associated not just with globalization, has probably accelerated under globalization, but at the same time, it's a feature that has always existed as far as we can tell. It goes back literally thousands of years. You find this in early agrarian empires. The bigger they are, the more stable they are, the more the top tier is going to benefit disproportionately. This is true of the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago. It's true of early modern world systems. It's true of nation states that exist in the context of contemporary globalized economies. It's a near universal feature. It's a feature that seems to be as old as civilization itself. So in that sense, the trapping of Europe by history with respect to inequality is twofold. It is trapped by what seem to be universal dynamics, that once you have enough integration, peace, stability, and so on, it favors the uppermost tier, the uppermost echelon in society. And it's trapped in its more specifically European history of long-term enduring polycentrism and fragmentation with respect to the persistence of national conditions for the general population in terms of all the other metrics. What does that mean for policy intervention? Murphy said I should also talk about policy options. Well, it means, at least it suggests to me, that there isn't much hope for policy initiatives at the Europe-wide level. Because if there are all these idiosyncrasies among countries, there is no one-size-fits-all, package of policies that you could easily implement. And as for elite growth, as for the 1%, well, it's a global phenomenon. So in one respect, a European-wide initiative would be too wide because it can't account for nation-specific differences. And in another respect, it would be too narrow because it's something that needs to target the entire planet. That's what has been all this talk about global wealth tax for billionaires. It's got Bill Superman and others have been going on about. Whether this is realistic or not is a different story. But that's the approach that actually would make sense in this particular context. So it turns out that because of this double entrapment, in a way, in terms of universal long-term dynamics with regard to elite groups, well, the attenuation in the late 20th century was a pretty short-lived blip, it seems now. And with respect to, unit-specific, nation-specific differences, that in both of these respects, there isn't really any sort of obvious recipe, if you will, that could be implemented on a European scale. So I'm afraid this is once again a pessimistic conclusion. I was told not to be too pessimistic, but in this case, this is where my attempt of fusing those two arguments has led me, taking account of the level of fees and specifically European outcomes. And I think with that, I've taken up about 35 minutes, and it's totally time for discussion. So I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I welcome your input. Thank you.
I have several questions myself, but I'm going to restrain myself because I'm sure there will be from the room. If you could identify yourself also for the sake of people listening online, please.
Sure. First of all, thank you so much, Professor Scheidel, for joining us. My name is Justin Daniels. I'm a DPhil student in international relations here at Oxford. But before that, I was at Stanford, where I saw The Great Leveler in the Stanford bookshop as one of the new releases at the time. So it's wonderful to have you here. If I can give you the choice of one of two questions, because I can't decide myself which one which one I'd like to hear from you more on. The first one is, you've talked quite a bit about inequality, in sort of terms of income distribution, but I was curious if you think about inequality as well from the sense of like gender inequality or racial inequality or even spatial inequality between city and rural regions. Do these sorts of inequalities tend to follow the same sort of Scheidelian thesis, or is there sort of variation there? And then the other question, to kind of go back to what Tim was saying about sort of something being in the water at the Stanford Classics department, as an emerging, or as someone who's doing a DPhil now, what is in the water at the Classics department? Like what has allowed you, giving any advice for someone who might like to be as omnivorous and sort of far-reaching as you in your scholarship one day?
The first question is easier to answer than the second. Okay. It's actually an optimistic answer, which is that other forms of inequality that also have a very long pedigree are being attenuated in an ongoing fashion, whether it's gender or sexual orientation or enslavement or any number of things, religion. I mean, pretty much all the traditional forms of sort of culturally based inequality have, at least in some parts of the world to a great extent, in other parts of the world to a less extent, but generally have changed in a certain direction. And this is something that I think makes economic inequality particularly interesting, because it seems to be impervious to that. It's not an epiphenomenon of these other changes. For instance, like, well, what effect does democracy have on inequality? Intuition is more democratic societies are more equal. Not so, right? It's much more complicated. And the same is true of all the other things. You can have all these innovations that push us in a certain progressive direction and still be very unequal. So economic inequality seems to be very Protean. It's infinitely adaptable and malleable. it can adapt itself to very different kinds of cultural configurations and political systems. And that's what makes it so resilient over time. Because otherwise this book wouldn't make any sense, right? We couldn't write about ancient empires and the Middle Ages and the early modern period and today in different parts of the world. If they're all totally different and it produces different outcomes, it doesn't actually. Because economic inequality can manifest in comparable ways in all these dramatically different systems. That's what makes it so interesting and also so difficult to address. Second question. Well, I mean, the second question is a bit, it's a, what is it, reverse causation. So, I mean, you basically get people who then hire other people whom they like to work with, and in the end you have a cluster of people who will do similar things and get on well with one another. But that's not something that just fell from the sky. It takes a certain amount of effort. And it's not going to last forever because sadly we're not immortal, so we'll see what happens there.
Yeah, it's about Paul.
Yeah, Paul Flanner from Mansfield. I wondered if you could, if we could sort of focus a little bit on the 1% a little bit more, so I can understand what you're saying. In some ways, you're saying they're almost untouchable unless there is a unified global policy, which we can probably, dream about, but not think it's going to happen. Is it the case, though, that the gap between the 1% and the 99% is getting bigger, as some writings seem to suggest? I mean, it's not a state. The 1% seem to be getting more unequal from the rest. And I wondered if that was the case, and if that happened over time, or whether that's a continuum. So we're now getting the situation where we've got the extremes that we read about, the Bezos and the Microsoft head and so on, Musk, and that is just extraordinary over time, and we can't seem to touch as we kind of as global growth continues. This 1% will get more and more separated from the 99%.
So there are two answers to this. One is, the convergence is exactly the 1% become more detached from the rest in all these various different settings. The other is, though, that it sounds good, 1%. There are many people in the 1%, right? So that's not really the issue. The issue is increasing differentiation within that group. It's the 0.1 and the 0.0001%. And that has accelerated even more so. So there's even more differentiation within the 1% and between the 1% and the other 99% of the population in terms of income, and especially wealth. Because income is tricky, right? You hold shares in companies, what's your income and so on. But in terms of wealth, that has really gone up very dramatically. And that kind of wealth is essentially untouchable unless you find ways of essentially confiscating some of it through some kind of wealth taxes and so on, which is very difficult in practice politically and also technically in terms of how you define the asset. We have this problem right now in California, right, where there's a wealth tax on the ballot. Billionaires are supposed to hand over 5% of their assets, and nobody knows what that means. What is 5%? How do I even do that? So it's a moving target. So this is the real issue. There have always been, well, there have not always been billionaires. I think Rockefeller was the first nominal billionaire in dollar terms. But now we are moving towards trillionaires who didn't really exist before. And even 10 years ago, people would have thought are not going to exist in our lifetime. So there you see the real acceleration, and this is the concentration that is the most untouchable. As for the 1%, it's not the same people, right? And people are moving in and out all the time. It's life cycle, it's different backgrounds, it's different professions. So there's not like, it's not like, that's different from the past. In the past, you had the 1% and always the same family. Exaggerate, but it's essentially the same cluster of people. And now it's actually significantly different people and much more mobility in that respect. But as a group, you see it more detached.
And the gap is wider between the 1% and the 99%.
Yes, that's what convergence is that I talked about. That would be the criterion, so to speak.
Yeah, Mariella Mier from a journalist from Spain. So beyond the 1%, in which countries in Europe the 99% is doing better? And even though there is no cluster, let's say, can be any lessons learned from any of those countries?
Well, that's a good question. I think the countries with the most equalizing outcomes are Belgium and Slovenia right now, or something like this. Don't hold me to it. But so it's usually Belgium is an interesting case, because why would Belgium be so different from the Netherlands, for instance, in terms of those kinds of metrics? Maybe because of the fragmentation, dysfunction built into the Belgian system, where you have you need to cater to different constituencies and keep everybody happy because of the inherent fragility of the whole setup. I don't know. Slovenia, I don't know. It's a very small, very homogeneous country. It's totally different from Belgium, right? And also has very low effective inequality levels. So that already creates a problem, right? You have two cases that are totally different. They're at opposite ends of the spectrum in some ways within Western Europe, and yet they share that particular outcome. So how do you develop, policy suggestions, because they're unlikely to, work for others still, if even those two cases are so different. But that's what we sort of need to think about. But it's not a straightforward process.
Hi, I'm Sandra Leon from the European Studies Center. My question is about the consequences of inequality, because you mentioned that maybe over time, countries have shown to be over the last decades very stable levels of inequality. But what about the consequences? Have they changed, even though countries have kept more or less the same level of inequality?
Yeah, they have changed forever. So, people compare inequality metrics hundreds of thousands of years ago, so it's a bad idea to do that. Let's say hundreds of years ago, with contemporary ones. It means very different things, right? If you have a society that's pre-modern, that has a US level Gini coefficient, it means that there are tons of people who don't have enough to eat, because, what little wealth there is concentrated in the hands of a few people, and there are many people who are desperately poor. If you live in the US now, you have the same Gini coefficient, but it's not that people don't go hungry and so on, but it's still a very different situation in terms of redistribution, transfers, and welfare provisions, and so on. Yes, the rich are even richer in absolute and relative terms than they were before, and yet the poor, even though they're poor, are actually effectively less poor, because poverty is differently defined. Right? If a poverty line, which would be the dream of many people in other countries in the world today, right? It depends on where you are. And historically, it's the same. Right? If people hundreds of years ago could have seen our poverty lines, they would have said, "I will never reach that level." So it's a moving target, and it's a really important question, because the question is, should we really necessarily focus on those inequality metrics in order to judge outcomes in terms of well-being, whatever you want to call it, human flourishing, like the Human Development Index does? Human Development Index doesn't actually foreground inequality. It foregrounds kind of GDP and literacy and other things that actually, but not so much inequality. It's certainly a secondary kind of factor. It can, we know from surveys, it can make people happy or less happy. That's different a topic. But in terms of actual welfare outcomes, there is a case to be made that sustained economic growth is ultimately more important than equalizing what's already there. That's not an argument against equalization, but it is actually the lifting of all boats at different speeds that ultimately delivers the most benefits to most people. But once you start talking this way, people say, "Oh, wow, you defend inequality, or you say we shouldn't care about it." The question is really, it's a strange kind of question. What is more important, right? What should be more focused on? The moment you focus on sustained growth, people say, "Oh, you're a neoliberal shill, right? You're interested." Those kinds of things. And if you are interested primarily in inequality, you are committed to social justice and all the rest of it. But it's they're not necessarily that connected, but you can't look at one without looking at the other.
But isn't there a case for saying, some people would say, what matters is how most people live, not that there are a few Jeff Bezoses at the top.
Yes, and why would you care, right? I mean, we care in part because we know more about it. And it's a problem not just within societies, it's a problem transnationally, right, internationally, that people in low-income countries can look at their cell phones and see how people live in high-income countries and so on. It wasn't really possible before. So there's a great deal of awareness. This is actually goes back to why all these books exist. There was really a big push after the financial crisis, because up to that point, people, academics knew about rising inequality. Nobody cared about it, pretty much, essentially, right? It was a slogan, but nobody really felt deeply about it. And then after the financial crisis, especially in the US, when temporarily many people were worse off because of underwater mortgages and employment and all the rest of it, all of a sudden, there was this light bulb going off saying, oh, it's about, rich people, it's about the 1%, it's about inequality. And all of a sudden, it captured much more attention, much more space in the public consciousness. And then, academics duly, proceeded and wrote all these books and saying you have to study inequality. And Piketty in particular wrote that wave very nicely. It was just done at the right time to capture that moment. So it's to some extent really a matter of perception, right? To how much we think and talk about it. Because the realities have been with us for quite some time now, but nobody really cared all that much about it till about 50 years ago. So that's again, it shows there are many moving parts.
So you have an extraordinary figure at the beginning of the book that in 2015, the richest 62 people in the world had the same net worth as the poorest 3.5 billion. 62, 3.5 billion. The very fact that we see that, the perception of that it's framed in that way, is surely different from most of human history. We see it as global.
Yeah. Yes.
Do you think anything, I'm interested you agree with that, but secondly, do you think anything follows from that in terms of possible reactions to inequality?
Thank you, Oxfam, because they are doing this every year and they're updating it. I'm sure it's even more extreme now. In a way, you could say, it's really apples and oranges, because to get to those numbers, you have to use nominal, dollar amounts, not adjusted for purchasing power, and so on. And the question then goes back to, does net worth actually matter? Income matters a lot, right? If I have no income, I'm going to die. Some form, right? If I have no wealth, that can be just fine, right? It's not, they're usually linked, but they're not linked one-to-one, right? So, of course, there are tons of people who have negative net worth and lead pretty decent lives. They just have a lot of debt. And so they have negative net worth. They live in a nice house and drive a nice car and so on. Not that 3.5 billion people, obviously. But, it's part of the story. So this is sort of as far as you can push it. And of course, that's why I put it in the opening paragraph, because it reads, well, that's what people do. If we look at changes in the global distribution of income over the last generation or two, adjusted for purchasing power, it's a success story, right? There's less absolute poverty in percentage terms, I think maybe even absolute terms. Or in Africa, outside Africa, I think even absolute terms. China, suppression of almost eradication, they call it, of high levels of poverty, and so on. That's a success story, and it's driven entirely by economic growth, right? It could not have been achieved in any other ways. You could do that too, right? And you could juxtapose those two statements, and they create very different impressions. They're both planetary scale statements that would not have been feasible before, because nobody would have thought in those terms. Nobody could have even put the numbers together. Now we can, but we can frame it very differently. And it really goes back to your question, my answer to it. It depends on what we choose to focus on. There are two very stories that seem to diverge quite a bit.
You focus on states, but across Europe, regions and cities, not only states, seem to be experimenting with leveling mechanisms. And you can see this especially in the area of housing, for instance, whether it's rent controls in Berlin, anti-Airbnb laws in Barcelona, social housing in Vienna and so forth. I wonder if there is a bottom-up learning that your largely, I guess, top-down framework kind of obscures. Is there a story to unpack on the regional?
Well, that's a very good question. And actually, it doesn't even fit into the Waldensframe story because it's interesting wealth. And once you have public housing that provides, decent housing, but not private ownership, that is outside that template in a way. It has a very real effect on people's well-being and how they live their lives and how they experience their lives and so on. Of course, it complicates everything even more because then to make it comparable, what do? You assign a quasi value as a pseudo wealth value to being in that kind of housing. Economists do all these things, but it makes everything even more complicated. But I totally agree. And again, that's why we show lines, because everything is always more complicated.
Thank you, Paul Betts, European Studies Center. I see what you mean about war and violence kind of driving less inequality, but just wondering if you're not downplaying a little bit some of the peacetime measures in which that's actually happened in quite a remarkable extent. I think Scandinavia, let's say from the 1950s to the late 1970s, as being a moment in which these things have actually brought effect without intense recourse to war and violence. And that brings me to my second question, which I find interesting that for 30, 35 minutes, there were no people mentioned at all. There was an occasional reference to Bezos in the top 1%. Suggestion to me is that policy actually doesn't matter. You talk about these macro historical forces, you talk about universal dynamics, you talk about fragmentation. I'm wondering what you feel that is this a world in which policy can change anything, or is it one in which it's these forces are so large that these are almost ineffective and naive to think you can actually find the face of some of these broader transformations?
My hunch is that, I'm sadly a reductionist. So yes, I tend to think in terms of those large impersonal forces that drive people. And of course, people are, rise to certain positions of eminence within those. But, that's a big debate, right? Within historiography more generally. What's the first one? I should not stop at the same.
About the Scandinavian.
So yes, so this is a really tricky one because you can take again two extreme positions, each of which would be incorrect. The one which is quite common is to say the war ends in 1945 and everything that happens afterwards is unrelated. That's crazy, right? There's literature on the welfare state and all these things. These things, just because the shooting stops, doesn't mean that the effects don't carry forward. And they eventually fizzle out, but it takes like a generation. And maybe even for demographic reasons, for people's life experience and its age out of the working age population. So this is not very well understood, I think, it's fair to say, because people don't seem to be terribly interested in tracking these dynamics. And the other extreme would be to say, it's all an outgrowth of that, right? Without the wars, none of these things would have happened, which we know not to be true, because there were unions before World War II, and there was public housing, and there were all kinds of things. It was just much less, right? And all these things that were sort of beginning to appear were hugely amplified and accelerated by these shocks. But they would have sort of developed probably over time anyway, it's just more slow. That's a counterfactual. Economists like counterfactuals, historians hate counterfactuals, so how do you go about working that out? Again, I think it's a really, I raised this very briefly in the book pages, because I don't know how to do this, but it's a really interesting question. The truth is obviously somewhere in the middle, but to find the balance is, I think, really difficult, and it is something I have the impression people don't care enough about. Because they have their priors, they have their positions saying, it's all about this, it's all about that. And really working through this in as much as is possible, you probably need pretty fancy models to get a handle on this. That is something I have not done. That's something I would like to really enhance our understanding of how historical change really unfolds. It goes back to the second question.
Can I just follow up on that? Because I don't know quite how to put this, but you seem rather cheerful about the whole thing. But it's a very sort of naive question. For you, is inequality a problem? And if it is a problem, what kind of a problem is it?
Well, that's a very good question. And again, it's something that I do not try to do in the book, but which there's now lots of literature on this. There's a book that came out called Collapse. Has anybody seen that? You can't publish my pain away. Anyway, I blurred it in another book. And it's like the reverse. It's saying if societies get very unequal, it destabilizes them, they fall apart, it's bad, right? It's bad for social cohesion, stability, peace, development, culture, etc., etc. Is that true? Is it measurably true? It's difficult to say. I mean, again, we lack systematic investigations of that. Because for every French Revolution, there is a place that doesn't, it's more unequal, like Britain, and doesn't have a British Revolution, right? So I'm very skeptical about this, that there is some kind of sort of on average pretty consistent effect. More inequality leads to bad outcomes in terms of overall stability. Because if that were true, Latin American countries would have collapsed a long time ago. And they've been around for a very long time. And they get away with being really unequal. They have for a while South Africa, places like that. So it doesn't quite seem to be true. Russia was not very unequal when the Bolsheviks took over. Parts of China were so equal that the communists had to foment like hatred in the individual villages to set people against each other because they had like 10% more than the other guy. And that's where you have the communist takeovers. So there's a lot of material to work with that is not consistent with the idea that inequality is an evil with respect to that. Now, on the moral or ethical side of things, that's a different question, right? That goes back to, I don't know, ask the question about the other kinds of inequalities, right, that are out there. And it then sort of pushes it more in that direction. Is gender inequality bad? Is discrimination bad? Is slavery bad? Yeah, they're all bad from our ethical, moral understanding. And by the same token, I think high degrees of inequality are also bad in that sense. But are they bad in terms of necessarily producing measurably bad outcomes with respect to political stability, let's say? Not necessarily. So there is, again, no single answer, I think, to that question. It depends on, what sort of lens you apply.
So let me just follow up on the historical question. So is there any statement one can make about the conditions under which inequality is more likely to produce the forces that drastically reduce inequality?
Well, I'm not sure anybody has probably done that, but it's a good question.
Because I mean, you're four horsemen of the apocalypse, right? Which are, for those who don't know, war, revolution, state failure, epidemics. One might think that one would be able to describe the conditions under which certain kinds of inequality would be more likely to produce revolution.
Yeah, the problem is that, I mean, if you look at most of history, pre-modern history, states fall apart at some point, you wait long enough, and they're all unequal. So how do you correlate, their inequality levels with the fact that they fail at some point? Plagues materialize because of rodents and climate change and things like this, not really to inequality, maybe very secondarily. So it's more interesting, arguably, for the 20th century dynamics, where you can say, would you have that kind of mass mobilization warfare without underlying levels of inequality or not? That's a more testable question. Of course, all these points have been made in a way, but I don't think there's a single compelling answer yet at this point. And for the communist revolution, it's really tough because you get Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. They should not be in Cambodia. Cambodia wasn't that unequal per se, and yet you get certain kinds of outcomes. So that's really difficult to generalize.
Thank you. Right at the back. Well, there was yeah. Right. And then the lady next to you. Yeah.
So I am Alberto, a DPhil student here at Oxford, working a little bit on the politics of inequality. So I wanted to ask you because I want to come back to the 99%, not only to the top, because yes, if we compare, for example, the US and Europe, we actually find that okay, in the US there was like this phenomenon of Hollywood out the middle, basically the empty of the middle, not in Europe. So basically we could find kind of a convergence, and also like for example, the increase in the median income in Europe basically was similar to the 50 percentile and not in the US. Basically, and this also is related because of employment protection or whatever, but it's also related because the dualization basically the flexibilization in Europe was because of dualization, the low end. So basically, not in the increase in non-standard employment, and it was not true in the US. So basically, I want to ask you, what do you think about these theories about varieties of dualization, of dualization theories, or varieties of capitalisms, because they find actually clusters and convergence, and also do you find if maybe if we think about the structure of inequality, maybe do we find convergence or different cluster in Europe, not only the level of inequality, like where inequality has increased in the low end, the top end, maybe different.
So your point is that there are developments in Europe that are sort of shared by European countries vis-a-vis the US. I'm sure that's true, but it coexists with all these other variations, right? So it creates an even more, complex picture in a way. Now, hollowing out the middle is interesting because there's now the argument that the middle has hollowed out in the US in part because there are more people in the upper middle class in a way. So you have certain, and it's not surprising because if inequality goes up, then dispersion goes up, and the boundaries between the different groups acquire different meaning from the ones we had because they're always percentages, multiples of a certain baseline. And you have more dispersion and more people are like in the higher, segments of that distribution and so on. So it's not that people fall out of the middle class and become desperately poor. They may actually leave the middle class and become upper middle class or officially rich. And I'm always struck, living in California, I'm always struck by how little wealth or income makes you officially rich, apparently, in the US. So if you compare that to Europe, you already have very big issues because then you see massive differences in that respect. Certainly, they're really. I saw a statistic that there are more households in the San Francisco Bay Area who have a certain household income, it's $100,000 and change, than in all of France. And France is what, 16 million people or whatever it is, and the Bay Area has maybe 6 million. And but then you have to adjust for what cost of living and risk, the kind of thing you're exposed to. Try quantifying that. So it makes comparison. I think that's actually the bottom line. It makes comparison really, really difficult.
Yeah. Hi. My name is Leire. I'm a little here in modern European history. And I have a quick follow-up on what you were saying before about inequality and its non-effects on world stability. Because I was wondering, doesn't inequality have an effect on electoral behavior, for instance? Like one could argue that Brexit or Trump are like direct effects that come from increasing inequality. And isn't that an effect on world stability?
On what exactly?
On world stability, like Trump, Brexit, inequality has different outcomes apart from the obvious.
Electoral, yeah. Well, I think it goes back to what I said earlier about it entering the public consciousness more. Well, it would be actually interesting to see how close the correlation is between that and certain upticks in populist movements, because they, of course, capitalize on that enhanced awareness of saying, oh, those people, the globalizers at the top, and they, screw you over and you are the victims and so on. And these things are certainly synchronized to some extent. To what extent they're causally related, I don't know. I'm sure people have looked into this, but I'm not familiar with that literature. But that's a very good question. It's certainly something that is, and that goes back to your question, actually. I mean, what are the effects of inequality? They may be sort of unexpected. It's not the destabilize everything directly, but they may work, you know, outflank existing institutions and come back to haunt you. Not necessarily because inequality is so terrible, but because people think it's really terrible. And that has an effect on political outcomes, electoral preferences, and so on.
Hi, Ignacio Jurado. I'm visiting fellow here in the European Studies Center. So I don't know whether this is a way of being a bit more optimistic, but I wonder whether we should give more credit to the fact that there are countries in which inequality is not increasing. So you mentioned that, you know, there might, you know, it might be difficult to reduce inequality, but the fact that there might be structural forces to push inequality upwards and countries might be able to contain it, that might already be a success. And I'm also thinking this because obviously the great levelers can operate, say, in all circumstances, but these levelers, I don't know how to call them, might change over time. And the fact that politics and institutions are able to adapt to them, I'm thinking about AI now. So now we have something that potentially can increase inequality. The fact that, you know, institutions and the political landscape might adapt to these new challenges and at least contain inequality, that might already be a success.
I totally agree. I should have emphasized this more. I mean, you can write a book. If you write a book, The Great Level, it sounds more dramatic than The Great Container or building it flat mechanism. I mean, so it's not very catchy, right? But that is a success story because you have all these forces that push a certain way, and under those conditions, the whole effective final outcome is more or less flat. Is a great success story, right? I mean, that speaks to the success of institutions that can do that, redistribution, whatever, what have you. So yeah, there is adaptability. You can't expect any reduction under those circumstances, but anything that's not a steady increase under those circumstances is already a success story. And in that respect, as I said, I mean, you shouldn't over dramatize it, right? In Europe, this has been the steadiness has been observed now for quite a long time. I mean, there are some fluctuations of crisis and so on, but for the last 25 years, there has not been a very strong trend in a particular direction. And you can say, maybe that's as good as it gets. Then, of course, the populist response is to say, no, we want it to be the way it was in the 50s and 60s, which everything was wonderful, right? And yeah, there was less inequality than there is now. You're not going to get back to that by any peaceful means. That seems highly unlikely. But that's the idealized vision, right? For Trump, certainly, because he grew up then.
Martin, comment.
Oh, thank you.
Then
Martin Conway, I'm in the history faculty here. You're picking out a vast range of examples which tend to blow the minds of historians. But it seems to me that your case studies often come back to Europe in the 20th century as being, you know, a rather important example of, you know, what seems to surprise you, which is that there isn't a great drive towards reducing inequality, that actually Europeans somewhere around the 1920s and 30s actually came to be reconciled to a kind of measured inequality within their society. Yes, of course, there were measures of social security, there were measures of inclusivity in terms of civil rights and so on, but there wasn't actually a drive towards material equality. And probably the communist experience after 1945 in Central Eastern Europe did not actually do anything to popularize that idea, shall we say. So how do you explain then why Western European society very much find their centre of gravity in this sort of measured inequality that actually proved pretty durable? We may think that it's been bashed around a bit by neoliberal politics in the last 20 or 30 years, but it hasn't fundamentally been overturned. Is that a product of, I don't think you're going to say it's a product of state action. You're probably going to say it's a product of social values, perhaps of the almost generalization of certain middle class ways of living. And you're probably going to also say that it's something to do with the invention of this rather amorphous thing that Timothy spends a lot of time talking about, which is the emergence of a European identity, which is somehow tied up with that sense of a measured inequality. Am I going along the right lines?
Well, talk about big questions. Yes, I mean that is a very big question. And I mean, to what extent? I mean, it is part of the question is, of course, to what extent is this affected by the communist experience, which already starts earlier, right? 45, right? And people look at this with some sympathy, and then they figure out, well, maybe it isn't that great after all, right? So as that becomes better known, I mean, what options are there really? If that's not the way to go, rather have a degree of growth and a degree of inequality and a degree of all these various things, and if that becomes your identity, so to speak, then yes, I mean that's how the different moving parts. So you answered it for me, right? I mean, that's how
There's a legitimization. So
it is. But I mean, it goes back to what I said earlier, that no matter what the system is like, it seems to be, unless you're really a Bolshevik, there's a great resilience of inequality. And even under Stalin, inequality comes back because they figure we have to compensate some people better than others. So if they do really important work, and you have the unofficial inequalities in terms of treatment and access to resources and so on. So even in those systems, there's a de facto revival. In the Brezhnev era, I think in particular, actually more inequality than before. So you can't always be in Lenin's war economy style and just beating people over the head and say, give me your stuff, or else. That's not really very sustainable. But unless you do that, it will creep back even under circumstances. So I think even those systems have built-in inequality levels that are lower, of course, than in, I don't know, Brazil. But there is that degree of tolerance. And then you have to wonder, well, what about Brazil, right? I mean, what is the configuration of expectations and norms and identities that sustain that kind of level, which is really quite different from what you see in Western countries. So that's a very big question. Problem is, giving this back to the historians, economists are not going to tell you this, right? I mean, it's a historical question, right? That would actually need historians to look at all these various different elements and try to bring them in conversation with one another. And that would require historians rather than economists or political scientists to spend more time and energy on questions of economic inequality and how it relates to all these various issues. And there are some people who do it, but not enough, to my mind. It's a field that I discovered when I wrote is very much dominated by economists who now take over historical questions, right? We can do it better. We have the numbers, we have the skills, we have the various models and so on. We'll figure this out for you. They will never figure that out, right? So that's something that historians are really, I think, called upon to double down on and stand back.
Are there any economists in the room?
Yeah,
Yes, Mihail Politics and the ESC. Two questions. So going back to Salva's question about the consequences, right? So if we think about the consequences of inequality for democratic survival, right? We're now in this era where we have this trillionaires, and probably unlike in the past, some of them have political ambitions and their worldviews are not quite democratic, let's say. And then on the other side, you have the populists that you talked about, but the far right part of the populists, although they do sort of occasionally point the finger at inequality, they also support policies that are really increasing and super boosting inequality, right? And if you think about who bankrolls not just MAGA, but also reform and so on, these are the billionaires that want even more inequality. So these two phenomena are sort of going hand in hand, and to me, they don't seem to produce a very optimistic outcome for the future of our democracy. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, I'm generally not optimistic about anything. So I'm always happy to be pleasantly surprised, but I think you essentially put your finger on it. And in as much as there are programs, they are logically incoherent, right? So if you took, say, a Trumpian program, if you were really serious about imposing harsh tariffs and rebuilding local industries, that would arguably have an equalizing effect somehow. It would also impoverish the society overall, but maybe equalizing in some ways. But that's not really pursued anyway. It's just more sort of gesture act. And at the same time, countervailing policies are also being implemented. So there's no coherent program. Of course, you can't expect coherent programs from any kind of populist movement. So I think I'm not sure it has necessarily also a negative effect very strongly. It probably is. Again, going back to the question of people, larger forces. To an extent, the larger forces are the ones that produce these trillionaires and so on. The answer is yes. That's a function of global integration, globalization, and we have enormous markets, and the winners in those markets will concentrate more revenue and gain and profit from more and more people who are wealthier and wealthier, and that will inevitably produce those kinds of people who then have political aspirations, which they could have more of, actually. You have to think in terms of the counterfactual, right? They could all go into politics. They don't actually. It's a good thing. There's no more interested in money. Or even philanthropy in some cases. Things happen. I mean, look at Gates. So it's not as bad as it could be. So to say something optimistic, it could actually be much worse, right? You could really have feuding plutocrats, so all have their own parties and their own, groups of followers, which is not really the case. So we should be grateful for what we don't have, actually.
Right, back. Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you very much, Sebastian from the Oxford Institute of Population Aging, hinting towards where my question is going. In economic demography, there's a very interesting theory, sort of saying like decline and prosper. The argument is that fewer people will lead to, amongst other things, to declining inequality. And one of the key mechanisms economic demographers argue is this sort of sustained levels of labor scarcity will lead to higher returns of labor again. What you sort of mentioned, that the shift that has been will revert backwards, right? Do you think this is realistic, or is it just another container? Like, will it contain levels of inequality, or might it even level?
But even that scenario, you still would have to really strictly control population flows, right, and migration, because no matter how societies in the West shrink, there are still hundreds of millions of young people in sub-Saharan Africa who are probably not very happy in many cases with conditions that obtain locally and would be very happy to move somewhere else. So unless you get rid of that too somehow, you're not even going to have those kinds of outcomes. So I think it's a matter of feasibility above all, desirability and feasibility. I don't think that's that kind of healthy shrinking or whatever seems to be sort of detached from reality, because you have to go back to a pre-globalization phase where these things are just not feasible and people can't move. And people can move and they know exactly where to move because they have all the information that comes to them at the speed of light at this point. So, of course, I don't think that's a thought experiment in a way. I just don't see how this would actually work out in the world we currently inhabit. And that goes back to ethics too, because then like ethical questions, is it ethical to interfere with those population shifts, right? So opens a can of worms.
Would like to. Do I see another hand in the room? Okay, yes, Millie.
Yeah, I have another historian's question. Remember, I'm also here with the ESC fellow, and I was wondering what is your approach to history? Because the way you use it, it seemed to me you use it whenever it confirms your argument that you're making about the present. Whereas I, as a historian, would think, isn't it much more interesting to use history, even if you want to go back to the Roman Empire, by looking at surprises, at where are ruptures, where not ruptures, looking from hindsight, like communism didn't work, but ruptures in the sense, why did communism even appear in the 19th century? And what's the interesting mechanism there? So to look at dissimilarities and not similarities. So why is your approach to history so different?
So the answer to that is that when I started on this project, right, I had this very crude thesis. You need certain things to reduce inequality. I fully expected that because of my prior ignorance, I would run into all these surprises and exceptions, right? And then my life would be hard, and I would have to figure out how to deal with this, and And to my surprise, it didn't happen. So either I did shoddy work and overlooked all of the surprises, or they don't exist. And since then, people have tried actively, right, to find the surprises, and they haven't been very successful. So I think that on rare occasions, obviously rare occasions, you can actually find these things that seem to apply across space and time in a sort of almost scary way. And most of the time it won't be like this. I mean, I'm a historian myself. And I know what I used to do, what my colleagues are doing. Most of the time it's not like that, right? And if we pretended it was like this, we wouldn't be doing our job. But once in a while it seems to be like this, which is, I find very interesting. And then I admit it attracts me. It attracts me more personally, for whatever psychological reason, than the the hunt for the surprises, so to speak, of which history is obviously full. I would so like to see a real surprise in that respect. Hasn't really quite appeared yet. There's some hope because there is now work on Japan, on Tokugawa, Japan. I mentioned this very much in passing, but we have great archives and registers and land tax registers and all. And they maintain a very hierarchical society for a very long time without any increase in inequality. And why is that? That's really weird, right? So that's something we need to understand better. So there are some semi-surprises out there, not in terms of leveling, but just in terms of keeping things at a moderate level without any of the sort of usual suspect factors. So I do agree in that respect, but they're really uncommon. And often when they are presented as such in the literature, you look at it and you think, it's because we don't really care much about this particular case. And once you drill a little deeper, it could be this way, it could be that way. That's just really not good enough. So there's a great deal of selectivity. There's a lot of world history that can't be covered in this way because the evidence just isn't good enough. It's quite possible that there are these exceptions and surprises lurking somewhere, but they're just not properly attested, or we haven't discovered them yet, so to speak, because of the nature of the evidence or whatever you would need to do to get to that point. I would welcome that, but the Japan example is right now one of the very, very, very few ones.
Quickly come back, because I think that argument to me only holds up if you look from hindsight, from the results, and not from why did it even emerge? Why did this discussion come around? Why?
Hindsight in respect to
the result of communism didn't work, was a surprise.
Oh, it doesn't matter if it does. Actually, I don't care if communism worked. If communism had worked better, then it would still have lower formal inequality. That would be fine. But it would still have been produced.
But it started as an idea that wanted to overcome inequality.
Oh yeah, at least that's the spirit. Yes, of course. There have always been movements to try to overcome inequality, but peasant uprisings in the Middle Ages and religious movements, all things. They're usually not very successful. Whereas the Bolsheviks apparently are successful because they kill enough people to do that, which is sad. But it seems that if you really want to go down the road, that's what you have to do. That doesn't mean there are not alternatives in principle. They're just difficult to track down historically because they don't usually seem.
I'll just follow up on that, because obviously another question historians ask is what's new and what's old. And it seems to me that in a good part of your talk, in the latter part, you were talking about capital and labor.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I mean, whenever capitalism began, and that is disputed, there was a long period of history when we didn't have capital and labor in that sense. So don't you think that something is distinctively new about inequality when we get capital and labor? That's point number one. Yeah. And point number two, if it is indeed the case that we are moving into an age when, on the one hand, with the financialization of capital, you're getting more and more generated capital, and on the other hand, there's going to be less and less for labor to do, if the predictions are right about AI, might that not be another sort of major shift in the basic ingredients of inequality?
So the future is, for that reason alone, opaque, right? I mean, if there are truly transformative changes of that nature, which may or may not occur, then all bets are off, in a way. And it's only the beginning of it. As for the past, I'm a bit more sanguine about this because, I mean, how we define capitalism, right? There has many definitions, people writing about it. There are different kinds of creating sort of capital-based economies, whether it's chattel slavery, right? And then the argument we now have about slavery being instrumental in creating a new history of capitalism, whatever you think of it. That can be traced. That doesn't really start as recently as historians write about it. think, I mean, you go back 2,500 years, you have systems like this in ancient Mediterranean, for instance, on a really large scale that are very successful and very durable. And they use people as capital, right? So it depends on how you define the terms, and they are engines of this equalization, right? They're engines of growth, and they're engines of creating very strong structural inequalities. So are they the same? No, they're not the same, but they are, I think, meaningfully comparable. And that's why inequality outcomes are also meaningfully comparable.
Yeah. I take it you think Karl Marx wasn't a very good historian. Yeah. Anyone else with a comment or question? In that case, I think we can go to the script and close. Doctor, thank you so much. I think we've had an immensely stimulating and surprisingly cheerful hour and a half on inequality. Thank you very much.